Good evening. Our program is about to begin. At this time, would you please take your seats and silence any electronic devices? Thank you. Would you please welcome Professor of History at the George Washington University, Denver Brunsman.
Good evening, and welcome to the 6th Annual George Washington Lecture. My name is Denver Brunsman. I'm a member of the History Department here at GW, and I teach a course on George Washington at his Mount Vernon estate. 6 years ago, when this lecture series began, President Knapp and the university's administration made a commitment to add an intellectual component to the celebration of our beloved namesake during George Washington's birthday week. In this, his last year as GW's president, I'd like to thank President Knapp on behalf of the campus community for ensuring that George Washington is an essential part of George Washington University. This will stand as one of President Knapp's great legacies here at GW. Today is the 285th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and we're in for a treat as we welcome the distinguished foreign relations scholar, Walter Russell Mead. Following his remarks, Professor Mead will take questions from the audience, so get your questions ready. In addition, immediately following the lecture and questions, there'll be a reception upstairs just outside of the Brady Art Gallery. President Knapp will introduce Walter Russell Mead. It's now my pleasure to welcome the 16th president of the George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp.
Thanks very much, Professor Brunsman. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's very kind of Professor Brunsman to mention the small role that I've played in trying to ensure that we really respect and honor and actually try to live out the heritage of the vision that George Washington spelled out in his last will and testament when he passed away in 1799. And he did really develop a vision for a national university that would educate citizen leaders in the new nation's capital, bringing students from what were then the 16 states, 13 former colonies and 3 new states. And of course, now we draw students from all 50 states and from 130 countries around the world. But we try to remain true to that legacy in which we are educating citizen leaders and connecting students with history of our nation, of their nations if they are joining us from abroad. And I recall that when I started, this was back in August of 2007, one of the very first things I did in my first couple of weeks was to go to visit Mount Vernon. And Jim Reese was the president of of George Washington's Mount Vernon at the time, was an alumnus of the George Washington University. And I talked to him about having a course taught there, and Professor Brunsman has really picked that up. Furthermore, when we had the opening of the George Washington's library, his presidential library, which is actually known as the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, that took place in September of 2013, and Professor Brunsman was in the inaugural class of fellows there, and I think taught the first class in the new library. So if you ever get down to George Washington's Mount Vernon, you want to visit not only the mansion, the museum, that's extraordinary, but across the highway uphill is a beautiful presidential library. It took him more than a couple hundred years to get his presidential library built. You know, I think President Obama's going to happen a little faster than that, but he was out of office a long time before they finally built that presidential library. Well, I really am delighted to join you for the 6th Annual George Washington Lecture in honor of our university's namesake. Tonight's lecture concludes the annual celebration of George Washington's legacy that began with our commemoration of the university's charter on February 9th and our annual bonfire the next day on University Yard. Earlier today, I traveled to the Mount Vernon estate with a large contingent of GW students to lay a wreath at Washington's tomb. And I think, Professor Brunsman, you were there earlier talking to students. I know you had to come back to campus, and it was, of course, a beautiful day to be there. I remember some occasions when I've kind of slid down a long, icy roadway to get to the tomb, but this time it was a gorgeous day. And it's an opportunity for our students, and I was really struck by the fact that quite a few of the students who came to that event were international students who wanted to understand what this connection was between our university and the founding president of this country. I want to offer special thanks to George Washington's Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom, which is a co-sponsor of tonight's lecture. the Institute's Executive Director, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Sam Goldman, and to Ambassador John L. Loeb, Jr., who was unable to join us tonight, but whose support brought the Institute to our campus. And it's now my pleasure and my privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Walter Russell Mead is the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College. A distinguished scholar in American strategy and statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, he's also the editor-at-large of The American Interest. Professor Mead served as the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow in American Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a Brady Johnson Fellow in Grand Strategy at Yale University, where he taught American foreign policy. He's the author of several books, including Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, which received the Lionel Gerber Award in 2002 for the best book in English on international relations. Actually, that was one of several awards the book received. And most recently, God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, a study of 400 years of conflict between Anglophone powers and their rivals. Professor Mead is a regular contributor to such national publications as Foreign Affairs, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. He's currently on the staff of Foreign Affairs magazine as a book reviewer. His lecture this evening will focus on George Washington's conception of religious freedom. In particular, he'll explore the sentiments expressed by Washington in his famous 1790 letter to the Toro Synagogue of Newport, Rhode Island, and will consider the relation of those sentiments to the issue of religious liberty in America and the world today. And I think it's fair to say, and we all realize, that that's an extremely timely matter to be discussing here on our campus in the heart of this nation's capital. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Walter Russell Mead.
Well, I must say it's quite an honor to be invited to give the George Washington Birthday Lecture at George Washington University on George Washington. And I think any American would feel the way I do, that this is an unusually important lecture, and I'm a little nervous, actually, as I get started. But before I begin my remarks tonight, I'd like to make a suggestion, especially to you students at George Washington University, perhaps the faculty also. There's a cause, I think, that every patriotic American ought to be concerned about right now, and that is the disrespect to George Washington shown by no longer celebrating his birthday as a national holiday. For generations, Washington's birthday was one of the most important days in the American civic calendar. Politicians and statesmen gave speeches, actors and entertainers did special performances and reenactments, and Americans all over the country read and reread Washington's important state papers, especially his farewell address, but not only, and the whole country had a civics lesson in the thought and the action and the example of the man who gave us more of our liberty and our stability of government than any other single individual. It's a travesty that we no longer celebrate his holiday. I would also add it's a travesty that we no longer celebrate Lincoln's birthday with a special holiday. So let me suggest, if there are any student activists here or faculty activists, that George Washington University should make it a cause to restore George Washington's birthday to the national calendar as a full holiday. Our subject for today, George Washington's statement on the place of Jews in America, a statement which was also an important statement about American religious freedom, one which was in fact issued before the Bill of Rights to the Constitution had been ratified, and so really represented a historic point in American life, is one of the most striking examples of Washington's leadership. In the space of a single letter to a Jewish synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, Washington articulated a philosophy of religious toleration that actually expanded the notion of toleration, and for the first time gave the imprimatur of the leader of a significant country to the idea of genuine religious freedom and equality. This was a breathtaking moment for the Jews of the United States, and actually for the Catholics. Washington also responded in a similar way to an inquiry from Roman Catholics wondering if they were also going to be okay in this new America. It was perhaps the most welcoming statement that the Jewish people had received from a Christian or even Muslim leader in hundreds, if not thousands of years. It opened a new era in American history, in Jewish history, and I think we can also say in world history. So we need to look into this famous letter, this famous correspondence that Washington entered into with a synagogue. The background is this. In 1790, George Washington was making a trip through New England in an attempt to kind of strengthen the still very weak bonds that held the United States together. He was a Virginian. The New Englanders were a little dubious about Southerners then, much as they still are today, and for some of the same reasons on both sides. And Washington wanted to remind the people of New England that though he may be a Virginian, he was the President of the United States. And he was received with great affection and friendship everywhere he went. He was the triumphant general who had won the independence of the American Revolution. He had then demonstrated an astounding moderation and patriotism by stepping down as the general of the Revolutionary Army, deferring to civilian leadership. Then again, when the country was in trouble, had stepped forward and helped to convene the Constitutional Convention, presided over that convention, lent his prestige, enormous prestige to that document, and had done more than anyone else to bring the United States from the first moments of a rebellion against England to the establishment of a respectable, moderate, democratic government, one obviously that we still enjoy today, and I hope will continue to enjoy. In the midst of this progression, he received a letter from a synagogue in Rhode Island. He was actually supposed, or the original plan was that he would get a letter from all 6 of the Jewish synagogues then active in the United States. But as anyone who studied American Jewish history will find, not surprising in the least, the synagogues were unable to agree on a single letter. And Washington actually received a number of letters from different Jewish groups as he was proceeding. But it was the one from the synagogue in Truro Synagogue in Newport that he responded to. And let me read you some excerpts from the letter they sent him. Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport. With pleasure, we reflect on those days of difficulty and danger, when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword, shielded your head in the day of battle. And we rejoice to think that the same Spirit who rested in the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel enabling him to preside over the provinces of the Babylonish Empire, rests and ever will rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate in these states. Deprived as we hitherto have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. For all these blessings of civil and religious liberty, which we enjoy under an equal benign administration, we desire to send up our thanks to the Ancient of Days, the great preserver of man, beseeching him that the angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness into the promised land may graciously conduct you through all the difficulties and dangers of this mortal life. It's a pretty good letter, and well calculated politically, appealing to episodes in biblical history that George Washington, as a good Anglican, would have been familiar with as a child, from childhood. Washington's response. Gentlemen, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Please note how he echoes their own language in this letter. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent national gifts. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So Washington quotes the Bible right back at him, and the crucial policy statements of this letter are by and large taken directly from the language that they had given him. Because we have to understand that this letter from the synagogue was a delicately phrased inquiry. General Washington, do we in fact exist as equal citizens in this republic? We're a tiny minority, 6 synagogues in the whole country. We have never enjoyed these freedoms in the memory of any of us. We can find no examples since we were driven into exile almost even then 1,800 years ago, where we've enjoyed this kind of freedom. Do you really mean it? And his answer was, yes, I do. And that answer has resounded through American history, and not only to American Jews, but to religious minorities of every description. Many of you may have seen today the stories about the Jewish cemetery that has been vandalized in St. Louis, and how a group of American Muslims in the area has joined together to help repair the tombstones that make up the damage to this cemetery. This is exactly the kind of country, the kind of action that George Washington had in mind. This kind of Americans bonding together out of a sense of common devotion to common principles, working together to fight prejudice and to maintain liberty for everyone here, irrespective of their beliefs. Now, what's interesting, many things are interesting about this exchange of letters, but to me, one is just how great a break it represented with the tradition of the English-speaking world out of which George Washington came. 185 years before this letter to the synagogue in Truro saw the opening, the premiere of a new play with King James I of England actually in attendance on Shrove Tuesday of 1605, the day before Ash Wednesday, as part of the carnival celebration, and the play was Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which, if any of you have read this play or know this play, is a profoundly anti-Semitic work about an evil Jewish moneylender who wants a pound of flesh from his Christian debtor. How did this change come about from Shylock's character being performed before an applauding king and courtiers to a Republican president saying that it's no more we talk about toleration, we are all equal here? What seemed to be going on? And I think if you look at American history during this period, you see several different things are happening. There's some connection, some of them are connected, some of them are almost random. None of them are caused by Jews or by Jewish activism or Jewish influence, but Anglo-American society, British and colonial society, ultimately American society, are beginning to change in ways that create the possibility of new kinds of toleration and new kinds of freedom for many different peoples, including the Jews. What's happening? You have a mix of religious, economic, and social political factors at work during that period. The first group of factors is religious. Up until the translation of the Bible into the so-called vulgar languages of Europe, out of Latin and Greek and into languages like English, and then the development of the printing press, which meant that Bibles and books generally were no longer these valuable, rare objects that the average person never even saw, much less had a chance to read. You have printing gives you cheap Bibles. Bibles are in English. Everybody can read one, and everybody does. And what people find when they do this is that in the Christian Bible, more than 2/3 of it is the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, as Christians call it, Tanakh, as it's known among Jews. And so Christians who were reading their Bible regularly, and many, many people for hundreds of years would read the Bible cover to cover and then go back and read it again cover to cover. President Harry Truman, while he was in the White House, read the Bible cover to cover 5 times. So this was a widespread habit in the United States. Well, you would spend 2/3 of that time reading the national literature of the Jewish people. And while if you only read the New Testament and the Christian Gospels, you read about the Jews arguing with Jesus. Ultimately, Jesus is crucified at the instigation of Jewish officials, though by Roman forces and a Roman decision. Nevertheless, the rest of the Bible is full of great Jewish heroes and great Jewish exploits. Jewish heroes like King David, who by his faith in God allows him to kill Goliath the giant. Daniel, whose faith in God delivered him from the lion's den. You can't help but begin to see the Jewish people in a somewhat different light. It didn't, by the way, mean that the Puritans who read their Bibles particularly wanted any Jews living in Massachusetts or Connecticut. They were Puritans, pure, get that, pure. They didn't want Quakers, they didn't want Catholics, they didn't want Jews. This is why, by the way, the synagogue is in Rhode Island, which was, if you remember, the colony that was founded by dissidents who the good folk in Boston kicked out for not being pure enough. And Rhode Island had an old and long tradition of religious liberty. So the next thing that began to happen is that the theologians of the Reformation, who were very influential in the English-speaking world, increasingly began to have a view that maybe God isn't finished with the Jews. The traditional medieval view was that, once God used to be interested in the Jews rejected Jesus, God more or less washed his hands of the Jews at that point, and there's no further role for Jews as the nation in God's plan. Individually, they can convert to Christianity, that would be very nice, but that's it. Protestant thinkers began, as they interpreted their Bible more literally, began to believe that actually at the end of history, Jews would again play a role in sacred history, that God wasn't finished with the Jews. In fact, even in the 1600s, Protestant thinkers began to believe that before the end of history, before the second coming of Christ, the Jews, and this sounded ridiculous, the Jews would go back to Israel, to the lands of the Bible, and rebuild their state. And so the Jewish people still had an unfulfilled destiny. And this again caused a certain reevaluation. God was keeping the Jews, for a reason. This also meant that Jews used to threaten medieval Christianity. There's this sense of, if the people who wrote the scriptures and the people who know the Hebrew language in which they're written, if they don't believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, maybe they're right, and maybe we're wrong. It's a very unsettling thought when the church is the only institution in many ways that's capable of holding society together. But for Protestants in this Reformation period, it actually begins to look, no, wait. The fact that the Jews are still here, stateless after all these years, oppressed, persecuted, but that they've somehow miraculously survived, that's actually a proof that God exists. The existence of the Jews becomes, for many Protestants, evidence of the truth of the Christian religion, which again causes a somewhat sunnier feeling to begin to spread about the Jews. Much more, by the way, when the Jews then, as the Protestants have been predicting since the 1600s, start going back to the Holy Land and start building a state and start winning wars against very, very heavy odds. Especially when they start doing that, when they fight their war of independence right after both the Holocaust and the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when many, many people began to feel that humanity really was entering into some kind of last times. So the existence of the Jewish people began to feel to many American and Protestant Christians as if it was a sign, not only is that, the big guy is upstairs, but that he's watching and that he cares, and that our ideas about him are correct. And Jews begin to switch in the American imagination from a dark, sinister force out there to a sign of hope. then there was a decline in the persecution mania. From about the time of St. Augustine on, many Christians, including many highly placed Christians like bishops and popes, believed it was your moral duty to persecute people who denied Christianity or embraced a false view of it. And we can, get into the reasons. Actually, our own age is certainly, we still have people around today who believe that people who have the wrong ideas should be punished, whether it's on a university campus or in a dictatorship somewhere. That only those who think correctly and speak correctly should be allowed to be part of our society, because otherwise their bad ideas will spread, and then that will cause untold harm to the rest. So we have a moral duty to persecute the people that whose ideas we find false and disagreeable. So this was a widespread view in the Christian world, but it began to fade a bit in the English Reformation, partly because in the 100 years of the English Reformation, sometimes one side is up and then sometimes that same side is down. So everybody has a turn persecuting people, but then everybody goes through a turn getting persecuted. And it really begins to cause people to think. And you get for the first time Christian sects, denominations, like the Quakers, who say it's a sin to persecute. If somebody has wrong ideas about God, leave that to God. Let that person work out their future with God. However, if they're wrong and they've made God angry, He is perfectly capable of demonstrating His displeasure. But your business is to try to walk righteously with God as you understand Him, and not to worry about whether the person across the street is doing it exactly the same way you do. And so again, a society like this is one where a Jewish minority is going to have a little bit more of a foothold. Beyond this, we get to a set of social and political reasons for the change. Actually, economic. Let me just say something about the economic basis of the change. One of the reasons that people were afraid of Jews in the Middle Ages and disliked Jews is because they were afraid of commerce. Economics wasn't well understood. And here you have these Jews are usually not allowed to have farms, were in the cities, often engaged in various forms of commerce, including money lending. People didn't understand it and didn't like it. Again, you can still find lots of people who don't like bankers and think that what the Federal Reserve is up to is some sinister something somewhere. And capitalism was associated with the Jews in the minds of a lot of people who saw there was the warm traditional society of nice people like us, and then there were evil economic forces out there that were disrupting our lives and threatening our institutions and our peace and creating inequality and crises and upheavals. And actually, to this day, by and large, people who have negative attitudes about capitalism will often end up with negative attitudes about Jews. Hitler made this point. Hitler hammered it home. Stalin hammered it home. If you go to Iran, you will hear people talk about Jewish influence and capitalism and its baneful influence in much the same way. In Venezuela, you can hear some of this same rhetoric. The Anglo-American world was as anti-capitalist as anybody back in the day. But over the 17th and 18th century, the British and the Americans started to become rather capitalist themselves. the Bank of England. The foundation of England's prosperity and might in the 18th century, what enabled them to beat the French in a series of wars and win a world empire, was England's ability to master capitalism. So suddenly, like, you're doing the same thing that supposedly the Jews do. Well, if at any rate it makes capitalism less frightening, and it also tends to reduce your antipathy to Jews. A great English novelist made this point wonderfully in a book called The Way We Live Now, about 19th century England, where his point is that the English aristocracy is every bit as deeply involved in speculation, stock markets, banking, and as the allegedly foreign and horrible Jews. So this changes attitudes. And then finally, we have a set of social and political changes that are felt and that, again, transform American society in ways that make the idea of a new kind of toleration favorable. The key here, I think, is the idea of denominationalism. Some of you may have heard that word, the word denomination used. You have Methodists, you have Presbyterians, you have Episcopalians or Anglicans. These are different denominations. They're almost like different flavors of Christianity. And in America, you start getting, you find yourself in a situation where you have geographically rooted Christian churches. So in New England, the majority is Congregationalist, like the old Puritans. In New York, it's mostly the Dutch Reformed, some Huguenot refugees from France, another kind of Calvinist, and then a bunch of like fast, hard-living, hard-drinking scum. Let's not ask too many questions about their religion, because we probably won't like the answer, much as there still is in New York today. You would then, in the middle colonies, you have the Quakers in Pennsylvania. In the southern colonies, you have the Anglicans, which is the branch from which George Washington himself came, the church in which he was raised. The Virginia Anglicans had an odd kind of tolerance. There's a story told about an Anglican priest who was once asked by a wealthy young man in his parish if there was a possibility of salvation outside the Anglican church. Really put the minister to the test here, because he didn't want to, lose this kid and the kid's money to his church. At the same time, he really didn't want to lie. So what he finally said was, yes, sir, there is such a possibility, but no gentleman would avail himself of it. So the Anglicans were already developing a slightly different approach to these questions of religious denominations. But in any case, if you're going to have a United States, you're going to have a bunch of different religions. You already had dozens of religions in America, varieties of Christianity mostly at this time. Voltaire wrote about this situation, trying to explain to the French why the English society is so different from French societies. And he says, if you have one religion in a country, you have despotism. He was thinking of France. If you have two religions in a country, you have civil war. Probably thinking of France at another time in its history. But if you have 30 religions in a country, they will all live together as happily as cats. Myself, I wouldn't say a house of 30 cats is my own ideal of tranquility, but Voltaire was a much greater philosopher than me, so we will leave him to it. But the idea that no single religion could hope to control the United States. The Puritans were really strong up in Boston, but there was just no way they were going to get those Catholics down in Baltimore to sign up to their church. The Anglicans in Virginia were pretty strong and proud, and they had those fantastic plantations and all of this, but they just weren't going to get the Quakers to switch religions. But on the other hand, nobody was really worried that one of these religions was suddenly going to conquer the whole country and force everybody to obey it. That you had a bunch of different religions, and none of them could conquer the rest, and all of them, knowing that, felt fairly secure in the presence of these other religions. But this wasn't just in America a thing of religious denominations. You also had sort of geographical denominations. You have 13 different colonies, very different places. Each of these had a different history, a different culture, and yet they were forming a nation. So in a sense, the colonies were like denominations within a national family. Unity in diversity became ingrained in the American experience. You also already had an awful lot of ethnic diversity in the United States at the time. Let's restrict this to the discussion of European settlers, because African Americans by and large weren't thought of as citizens or citizenship material at this time. Same thing with American Indians, and the presence of Asians was negligible in the country at the time. But you had, people felt great differences. Upstate New York was full of these Dutch-speaking weirdos. Then you had these crazy German-speaking Pennsylvania Dutch in Pennsylvania, where whole districts of Pennsylvania, people really didn't speak English. But you had the tremendous cultural differences between Puritan New England and the South. In fact, during the English Civil War, Puritan New England sided with Parliament on one side of the English Civil War, and Virginia sided with the king, the other side. So you had great differences in political culture, history. America from the beginning was a more complex kind of unity that had lots of spaces in it for minorities, had to have them. There could be no national unity without offering a place to minorities. This, it seems to me, is what George Washington understood. And this is what George Washington was expressing in this letter to the synagogue. It's not that a bolt of lightning had led him to some kind of religious conversion and belief in toleration and faith. That's not the kind of man George Washington was. It's not that, George Washington's talent wasn't like the talent of, say, Thomas Jefferson, who had the talent to have kind of a flash of insight and then to put down his thoughts in these fiery, eloquent words in ways that could shake a people. George Washington was not that kind of genius. Nor was he kind of sort of the great debater like the, Hamilton and Jay writing the Federalist Papers and writing. That's not, George Washington was not a flashy intellect. He was not an original thinker. What Washington's great talent was, in many ways, I think, was to feel and understand the foundations of his society and his country, and then give expression to this common sense of truth and value in word and deed in a way that revealed to other people, oh yes, he's right. This is what I think. This is the kind of country I want to live in. Washington was the voice of this new American government and the conscience of this new American state, precisely because Washington expressed what everybody felt and knew. And Washington's instinctive embrace of this different kind of tolerance was powerful and overwhelming precisely because, as he uttered it, people who heard him or read this letter realized that it wasn't controversial. He was not saying some weirdo, advanced, deconstructionist theoretical critique of 18th century American society. He was expressing the deep common sense of his people and his time and his place. This is a very different approach. This American denominational approach is a different approach to questions of religious liberty than what we find even today in many other democratic societies around the world, including Europe. And let's just take attitudes toward the Jews as a test of this, or as an example to illustrate it. Because of this denominational sense, where Americans can have, an identity as an American, but then can have a sub-identity. I'm an Irish American. I'm a Franco-American. I'm Italian American, whatever it might be. I'm gay American. I'm Muslim American. Lots of different choices on that menu, and we're all used to this. In Europe, the way the Enlightenment worked was different. The Enlightenment said, okay, we're going to get rid of discrimination against Jews. We don't like laws that limit Jews, but here's the deal. The Jews are going to need to give up the idea that the Jews are a separate people. I mean, this is literally what happened in France, where the Jews are told, look, if you're willing to say that there's no such thing as a Jewish people, but merely that you are French citizens of Jewish faith, but otherwise you are as French as all other Frenchmen, which means you don't have these sub-identities, we're okay with that. And so just as there are French Catholics and German Catholics and Italian Catholics, there are French Jews, German Jews, and Italian Jews, and that's okay. This is a very different approach. American Jews were never asked by the wider society, never really occurred to the wider society that one needed to ask this, to give up the idea that there is such a thing as a Jewish people around the world. I am a member of that people, and yet I am also as American as the person standing next to me who is a member of the Irish nation, which also exists beyond the walls of the United States. This, by the way, is one reason why the Zionist movement seemed like a logical outgrowth to Americans of Jewish integration into the U.S. That is to say, yeah, look, the Irish want Ireland to be independent. The Poles want Poland to be independent, the Polish Americans. You know what? The Jews in America want the Jewish state to be independent. Well, duh. All right. In Europe, actually, the idea of the Jewish state turns out to be much more difficult for people to sort of process, because the idea is that Jews are not a people. So if you think of a Jewish state, you're either thinking of kind of a racial state, or you're thinking of a theocratic religious state, which is building a state on the foundation of a religious identity rather than on the idea of a national identity. So that Zionism for American Gentiles, non-Jews, seemed natural and understandable. In fact, many American Gentiles were pro-Zionist well before the American Jewish community was pro-Zionist. In fact, some Jews early on were worrying that the Americans were supporting Zionism the way they had supported the colonization of Liberia, like ship them out. Let's give them a state so they can leave. But in fact, again, the American concept of toleration for the Jewish people lends itself rather naturally to a kind of instinctive, you don't even have to process it or think about it. Yeah, well, of course they're a people like other peoples. And of course, like other peoples, they should have a state. Now, by the way, in the same way, this leads to the American sense of, well, the Palestinians are a people too, and they should have a state. This two-state solution to Americans feels like the natural right. You got two peoples. Every people has a right of self-determination. Each have a state. Duh. It turns out these things are a lot more difficult to make happen in practice than to conceive of in the abstract. But just as American opinions keeps turning to the idea that Zionism is a natural and appropriate ambition for the Jewish people, so does it also believe that the establishment of a Palestinian state is a natural and appropriate ambition for the Palestinian people. It's not my job up here tonight to tell you whether that's right, either of those is right or wrong, or much less how to then bring this into being. That would be a very different kind of talk, and you might need a different speaker for it. But what I am here to say tonight is that George Washington expressed in his day a set of principles about how people can live together under conditions of true, not just civil equality, but fraternity, even though they have different ethnic roots, different religious beliefs, different cultural ideals, that it's still possible to be a nation. And if I can tie it all together, what I would say is one of the reasons we should celebrate George Washington's birthday as a national holiday is because now more than ever, Americans need at least one day in the year when we dedicate ourselves to the study of the ideas of the man who helped us become the country that so many of us hold so dear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. We'll now welcome questions from the audience. We're going to get comfortable here, just like our living room. And we just ask that you raise your hand. We have roving microphones, and if you could identify yourself and just keep your question to the point, that would be terrific. We have a question down here. Looks like the microphone's coming.
Hi, I'm Professor Dan Schwartz. Thank you. A lot of food for thought in your lecture. I'm wondering if we maybe could bring this concept of religious liberty, though, from the 18th century to the 21st. Because I think, what we're seeing right now is that this idea that in Washington's speech is so kind of full of kind of emancipatory potential, that what you're seeing a lot today in terms of the invocation of religious liberty is that it's often in a kind of discriminatory context. That my freedom of conscience should mean that I shouldn't have to cater or do the floral arrangements for your same-sex wedding. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily use the word bigotry, kind of a loaded term, but nevertheless, I mean that is the context often in which this term is invoked. And I've even read that the Trump administration is planning on expanding the range of possible invocations of this idea of religious liberty in order to kind of provide further protections for people who want to engage in what could be seen as a kind of discriminatory activity. So,
Well, I think it's interesting that there are interesting limits to Washington's letter there. He says the government, offers to, bigotry, no sanction, persecution, no assistance. If I've got that right, maybe it's the other way around. But he doesn't say the government will stamp out all bigotry and prevent all persecution from happening. There is a sense in Washington's statement that you've got to, in a sense, you have to cut people some slack. That if the government were to, I imagine that I won't say that Washington would think that, because there are far too many people in America who pin Washington's label on their own pet ideas. But I think that in general, you look at the way people in the 18th century thought about these issues, and there's a sense in which a government that tries overzealously to enforce a right can be as bad as a government that doesn't take any action whatever. Washington generally stood for a middle course. Again, something I think that was natural to him in the Anglican background, where you're never going to get it all right. You have a little tolerance, some fuzzy areas. I don't know how he would apply that to this situation, where he would see that. But I do think, I would now say just on my own sense rather than on his, that striking the balance between liberty has to mean the liberty of people to do things that you don't approve of. Because if your idea is that, everyone has the freedom to do the right thing, and nobody has the freedom to do something that I personally think is wrong, then you get into a situation where the country becomes teams of people competing to persecute the other. So I think we've all got, wherever we stand in the culture wars, I think we all need to figure out how to cut each other some slack. And my guess is if we don't do that, we plunge the country into a cycle, a political cycle, where none of us would probably like where we come out in the end.
All right. More questions? Looks like we have
A
a
question
few in the center.
Thank you. I was wondering, I thought it was really interesting how you talked about how Jewish Americans weren't asked because they didn't need to be asked to be citizens of the country in addition to their religion. And I was wondering if you thought that was because the Enlightenment or the emancipation happened, or had happened and these Jews were from these European predominantly countries, or if that was because the US was unique in the sense of religious liberty.
Right. I do think that the U.S. was unique in the wedding of pluralism and liberty. That is, that the French Enlightenment was much more this idea that, okay, in the past, the unenlightened world looked to superstition, to theology and popes to tell them what was right or wrong, and that was really stupid and dark. We, however, look to the universal light of reason. Fortunately, I, Robespierre, understand it completely. Thank goodness, because now I can tell everybody else what to do. There was less of a, it's harder in that tradition to find a legitimate space for real dissent. And that remained, even at the time, this was an issue. Many of the French thinkers of the Enlightenment were actually somewhat anti-Semitic. They were opposed to the kind of church-based rules. But what they felt was that if the world, if the world goes right, then everybody will give up all of these superstitious religious elements in their thinking, and then so that means that. French identity might survive because everybody speaks French and here we are, but what happens to the Jews without religious ideas or superstitious or traditions that aren't sanctioned by reason? The Jews need to assimilate. And so the question of where do you find real space for a religious or cultural minority? In a sense, a federal system, a denominational vision of the world, I think offers a more secure lodgment for that. And it is interesting how much more difficult it has been. Whilst in the United States we have had our problems with anti-Semitism and continue to have them. On the whole, the different levels of anti-Semitism have been one of the real markers of difference between American historical developments and developments in most of Europe.
So first let me say it's a fascinating talk and a great account I felt in many dimensions, and I was really struck by the frequent use in your talk of the word toleration. and you sort of indicated the differences between the American approach to toleration and certain European approaches. And on many accounts, European toleration developed in the 17th century in reaction to the horrors, the horrible violence, and the exhaustion of the Protestant Catholic conflicts we know as the 30 Years' War. In fact, we have Locke's Letter of Toleration, which seems to reflect that kind of reaction. But what always has struck me about this particular letter of George Washington's is the way he distinguishes toleration from liberty and freedom, and actually says, I'm not talking about toleration.
Right.
And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit of what you think he meant by making that distinction, because it's always been a very striking one.
No, I agree, and I tried to get to this a little bit, that the Jews are here, are citizens of right. Toleration always in this European context was, okay, I'm the king of France, and I'm the absolute king of France. I basically do anything with you I want. However, it would not be pragmatic in me to persecute you so severely that you can't continue to pay taxes. So that even though I think you're wrong, and I think it's a tragedy that you're here, I am nevertheless going to allow you to continue within very strict limits to have a kind of a second-class existence in the world which I run my way. That really is what I think Washington was thinking of when he thought about toleration. Liberty is the different, you're as a human being, you're endowed by your Creator with inalienable rights, no more and no less than the person sitting next to you. And you have an absolutely equal right, whatever your religion. Washington hadn't worked his way to this, but whatever your skin color or previous condition of servitude, etc., to play an equal role in the political machinery, in the politics of life, determining where we as a country go. So this is, I think Washington is saying, this is not a concession that we make to you for pragmatic reasons while we hold you in second-class status. You and we, I and you are equal citizens of a free government, and let's have at it now. Let's live.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Professor Mead, thank you. My name is Rabbi Edelstein. I'm not on faculty here, but I work with students at GW. Your talk was so wonderful in so many different ways. I hate to limit it to one question, but I'm going to limit it to one question on one angle that I'd love to hear your impressions, observation in a comparative sense, maybe even a little prognostication. But it seems like among many interesting facets of the Trump phenomenon, there's quite a fascinating situation where I don't know if there's ever been a case where in hundreds of years or whatever, someone so close to power and so close to the president himself is an observant Jewish person, and yet the base of Trump's support largely comes from, maybe I'm generalizing, but it seems like there's a strand that is quite suspicious of Jewish bankers like Steven Mnuchin or whatever, so Trump it just seems like a fascinating, strange phenomenon of a closeness in a certain way to Jews, but also at the base of his support, and I know it's been in the news lately how much or not, but an undercurrent of a very different world than that of Trump's son-in-law and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, you're raising some really interesting questions. My own sense is that that there has always been and likely always will be a kind of an ugly strain of anti-Semitism in America, just as there's an ugly strain of racism in America. Being American is not an exemption from the human condition with all the sins and failings that humanity is capable of. So it would be ridiculous to say that there isn't any anti-Semitism among Trump voters, or for that matter, among Clinton voters, I suppose. Yet, it's very interesting that in the middle of this campaign where you had all these tweeters, and I think a lot of us would say a lot of that is kind of astroturfed robo-tweets and bots, putting this bile and filth onto the internet in a way that's really shocking and horrible. You look at some of the polling among Trump's supporters, one of his most popular stands is support for Israel. That Israel right now is more popular in the United States than it's ever been. And that of all if you think about all the traditional elements of American foreign policy that Trump has shown any willingness to break with or challenge, the alliance to Israel is conspicuously off that list. Now, I think that President Trump is, among other things, very good at gauging the mood of his political supporters. In some ways, obviously, you can be a strong supporter of the American-Jewish alliance and still be an anti-Semite. There are people, I think, and possibly some of them in Trump world, I don't speculate about individuals, actually who might agree with some of the classic statements people make about how Jews are termites burrowing in and weakening national structures and all of these kinds of things that people have been talking about for a long time. However, because America is Israel's best friend and Israel is the apple of the Jewish eye, America uniquely can have a different kind of relation, because American Jews, even if they're dual loyal, if they're mostly loyal to Israel, that still makes them loyal to America, because only America is protecting Israel. Now, these ideas are based on so many falsehoods and misunderstandings, I couldn't even begin to disentangle them. But there is a sense in which many currents, many sort of populist nationalist currents in American life that in other countries have been associated with anti-Semitic ideas for entirely different reasons are really pro-Israel. And that again, and anti-Semitism has from time to time in American populist movements, anti-Semitism has kind of reared its head. The 1930s, 1880s and 90s in particular, at other difficult moments. It has never become the main characteristic of an American populist movement. So you would see all over the German world, well before Hitler, there were all kinds of populist movements where anti-Semitism for the Loeb in Vienna and other politicians in other places was, that was the big rallying cry. That's just not how populism has worked in America. So I don't want to say that America is immune to diseases that have proven to be contagious around the world. But I think a rational, sober assessment of where we are can be reasonably optimistic that even the circles in the United States where one might expect anti-Semitism to be strong based on comparable studies with populism and so on in other places, what's remarkable is how much weaker it is. And in fact, the weakness of anti-Semitism in the United States is, to my mind, one of the most interesting elements of the phenomenon overall that I would call American exceptionalism, and what makes America different. One of them is its extreme resistance to these sorts of bouts of anti-Semitism that from time to time have overswept various countries around the world.
All right. Well, that was our last question, but we're not quite done because we have a token of appreciation for you, because you are at the George Washington University, of course, giving the George Washington Lecture. And this is the magic lectern that produces the man himself.
Oh.
Thank you so much for a marvelous talk this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, really
Great.
it.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you very much.
And thank all of you. I want to remind you we have a reception just upstairs, and come on up and talk to
Walter Russell Mead.
Great.
Thank you.